In 2024, I read 232 books, and condensing that down into a top 10 was surprisingly easy. These 10 books were truly special. They had to be included in my top 10. There simply wasn't any room for something merely excellent. At number 10 we have Anita de Monte Laughs Last by Xochitl Gonzalez. This is a two timeline novel. The later one, set in the 1990s, follows Raquel, a Latin woman studying art and who has decided to study influential artist Jack Martin because it is her professor's favourite artist. He is somewhat surprised to find out about his wife, Anita de Monte, an up-and-coming young Cuban artist who tragically died when she fell, jumped, or was thrown out of her apartment window. Anita de Monte is based on real-life figure Ana Mendieta, while Martin is closely based on Carl Andre. Andre recently died, and I wonder if this book could have been written with him alive. Galleries showing Andre's work are often met with protests still to this day. What I think is genius here is that two timeline novels really should have a large overlap in themes. Even with their differences, they should have large parts that mirror each other to make them work. It is a chance for the author to show themes from different perspectives, to add multiple views, to layer depth into a novel. Gonzalez doesn't do that. Instead, rather, she is looking at the impact of one woman's life upon the next, even though there is nothing connecting these women except for an identity. Both these women are Latina. Anita de Monte is a bit of a radical artist, not afraid to take risks and to try things. Neither was Jack Martin, for that matter. But the two are seen very differently. Martin's allowed to break the rules. He's allowed to be the rebel. He is the white man. He is the James Dean of the art world. He is not the young Latino woman. But Gonzalez never really says if this inequality is down to race, gender, money, connections, or the rules that you're allowed to break and the ones that you're not. She leaves that for you, the reader, to decide. Nonetheless, you can see how much harder it is for Anita de Monte to break through than it is for her partner Jack Martin. And then there is this ultimate burying of her as an artist. How will future generations see her? They won't be told about her. This really is an exploration of death of the artist. Raquel, some 15 to 20 years later, is still in a world dominated by white men. She is made to feel like an outsider, and Gonzalez is questioning if this is intentional or not. Even in her short life, de Monte produced some exciting art pieces, and Raquel could have so easily seen somebody like herself in the industry, somebody accepted and being discussed, but she doesn't have the example. Yet, she is still quite welcome. She's dating Nick, a rich and talented young artist from her class. Somebody with a family history in the art world. She is cultivating the connections that she needs. But nonetheless, is she welcome? This is clearly a super feminist novel. While de Monte and Martin had a horrible and toxic relationship, Raquel and Nick seem to have a much healthier relationship on the surface. But yet, not everything is right. One of the things I love is that while Martin is the worst type of man, Nick is actually pretty lovely, but he still doesn't get it. He still mistreats Raquel because he doesn't understand things, because he is born into a caste that means he doesn't have to because of how he was raised. We see two very different type of bad relationships. The run for your life horrible and the that's a red flag. And maybe Nick would be better at relationships if he had some better examples in his life to learn from. Maybe he's just young and needs to figure things out for himself. This novel is ultimately arguing that representation matters. It influences our actions. Whether it is demonstrating consent around the choice in haircut we get, or which side of the window you exist on, or whether it is about belonging and thinking your work is valuable in a certain industry. It is also exploring the self-serving structures of said industry or institution that prop up the status quo, that keep the persecution of minorities going. And for regulars who watch my channel who want to know just how good I think this book is, this is a novel that crosses into magical realism territory. Magical realism, the worst of all genres. And yet, this book is still amazing. The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. 1961 Netherlands, and Isa is living where she always has, in her family home. Except, is it actually hers? It is her brother Louis, whose name is on the deed, and his fiancée Eva is coming to stay for a month while he is away on business. Something Isa reacts to with great hostility. However, her attitude towards Eva will gradually soften. This is a book with fruit on the cover, and for those of you who knows what that symbolizes, I guess you're going to know a little bit extra about this book going into it. For those of you who don't know what that symbolizes, well, I guess you're just going to have to figure that out by reading the book. As our two women get closer to one another, the date set for Louis' return grows closer, and you wonder, what does the future hold for Isa and Eva, and who will be living in the house when he returns? Then Isa notices a spoon missing from the collection, a candle holder. Could it be Eva? Is Eva getting close to Isa just to steal from her? The question of if Eva is stealing takes on a lot of complexity by the time the novel finishes. This book is doing a lot of things, and one of those things will really make you question possession. What is it? What is ethical about it? And so on. The Safekeep is a novel built around fantastic character work. Isa is so hostile at the beginning of this novel, I almost didn't believe her as a character. But you know what? I've met a few people like her, and Yael van der Wouden is able to build this acerbic character in a really believable way and counteract her with Eva, who comes across one way but has so many different layers herself. And neither of these characters stay the same as the novel progresses. She has created two fantastic characters to undress. Get your minds out of the gutter. This is really hitting that sweet spot of fiction that I love. Literary fiction that understands the simple enjoyments of reading a book, but that don't let those enjoyments get in the way of exploring the themes and the ideas, but rather lets the two of them work together to create something better than the sum of its parts. Tenan Square by Lei Wen. There'll be no prizes for guessing what historical event this novel is based around. Tenan Square being the climax of the novel that starts out as a coming-of-age story set in a working-class suburbs of 1970s and 80s Beijing, and following Lei, same name as the author, or rather same name as the pseudonym that the author is using so that they can remain anonymous. There are so many individual aspects of this novel that are so well done. At times you feel like you're reading Orwell or Kafka as this child slowly starts to appreciate that the society in which she lives is not as it seems, as her childish fears of adults morph into a not so childish fear of the authorities around her. This kind of makes this novel sound like it's a blending of political criticism and dystopian, which I guess it is. However, to classify it as such is to neglect the amazing storytelling, the characters and the emotional consequences of the post-Great Leap Forward era, or the comedy genius involved in creating the very irreverent and sarcastic grandmother. This is not just a political criticism novel. This is a fully formed novel touching on so many aspects. It's a novel equally at home on the bookshelf of a highbrow literary fiction critic or a hedonistic historical fiction lover. And I think that description probably roughly sums up the spectrum of my viewers. So I guess pick up this novel regardless of who you are. I momentarily thought this novel was a retelling of 1984, and this is the author playing with our knowledge of that text to let us know that nobody can be trusted. It creates such an isolated setting in this very busy city. It really does feel like a student standing in front of a tank. Lei makes friends with Jen, the son of a local manager, which lets us see this real class system in work too. He doesn't seem scared of anything and is more willing to openly question the state and authorities to sow discontent. And I really like what Wen is doing with Jen as this book continues into adulthood and university for the two friends. There are feminist themes running through this novel too, and that might be a Western interpretation of the relationships in this novel, which so often depicts a working class woman in a relationship with a much more privileged man. Maybe the power dynamic is about gender, and maybe it is about class or access to power, but I can't help but think it's about all of those things. But nonetheless, as the reader, we're left to question, where does this imbalance come from? While at university, Lei makes friends with the quirky actress type Madame Macau, who seeks to take petty revenge on people who have wronged her, mostly just by embarrassing them. This is such a great demonstration of exactly what Lei Wen is doing. Every time the plot moves in a different direction, a new character is introduced or whatever, Wen is looking for how she is going to make her political themes sing. She's looking for how to satiate our cerebral enjoyment while making the book just more fun to read, to satiate our bookish hedonism too. Macau is funny. Her willingness to embarrass everybody and take risks in doing so makes Lei very uncomfortable. She's scared they're going to get caught and get in trouble. It serves as a point of tension, and then you have to ask yourself, why is it so important to Madame Macau? Why does she have to humiliate her oppressors? Is embarrassment a good form of protest? And to answer that, I'd say it certainly undermines power. You also cannot tell me the ending of that character's story isn't feminist. Lei Wen lived through the Tenan Square protests, and a question we will not be able to answer from the text is how much of this is autobiographical, how much is autofiction, or how much is just fiction inspired from her real life. The novel is more character focused than history focused. So if you're a historical fiction reader who enjoys learning about history while reading a good story, you're not going to learn a great deal about the events here, but you do gain a wonderful appreciation for what life would have been like for the various people who lived in this era. The Great Undoing by Charlene Alsop. The only bad thing about this book is that cover. I demand a reprint. This is a novel that is really about the truth. It's about history, point of view, and storytelling, told with an Indigenous Australian flavour. But it is also a dystopian novel set in a world whose satellites have been attacked, causing planes to be grounded, communications to be local, and technology to be static and stuck. It follows Scarlett, whose job is to correct historical records and establish the truth, but who ends up being trapped in the UK when the satellites are attacked with no way of getting home. And rather than this being a true dystopian novel, it is more a journey of identity as Scarlett navigates having one Jewish and one Indigenous parent, which brings up a question: am I Indigenous enough? A theme that is explored in multiple aspects of this novel. And this is a question that really lends itself into another question. Am I Indigenous enough? Leads to what exactly is indigeneity. Scarlett's ancestors allowed her to look into Australian history, researching the role of Indigenous soldiers in World War II. The soldiers on one side of her family were likely involved in the saving of her ancestors from the other side, without which she wouldn't be here. But how were those soldiers treated when they got home? There is something very specific to Aussie readers here, specifically white Aussie readers. We all know what we've been taught. And personally, I have never considered that our Indigenous population must have fought for our army in the World War. I mean, of course they fought together, but why didn't this act as a catalyst for reconciliation? Why isn't it presented as something that happened? Of course, we're never told Indigenous people fought, but this all comes back to Alsop's underlying theme. How is history told? How is it recorded and passed down? We are constantly told about the evil of settlers, but we are never told about the virtues of Indigenous folk. This is not just an Indigenous story. Also, it draws comparison to Australia's treatment of migrants, of a group of people our media labels as boat people. This novel is a massive punch in the direction of our media, our historians, our publishing industry, which are all represented by a book, A Short History of Australia by Ernest Scott, the defaced book on the cover, which Scarlett is reading and correcting. Throughout this, we get quotes from Scarlett's favourite authors. It's really a good book if you want to add a few more novels to your TBR. We get musings on the Tour de France, thoughts on travel, and a romance. The truth is, there is just way too much in this novel for it to work. The fact that it does is incredible. No author should look at this novel as a blueprint to learn from or to replicate. Yet, at the end of this novel, we have this really thrilling plot. We have an amazingly built protagonist, a setting that equal parts makes you hopeful and scared for our future, an explosion of ideas and thoughts that can honestly be hard to keep up with at times. I don't understand how, but everything in this novel is absolutely sublime. It shouldn't work. It should be an absolute mess, but yet Alsop pulls it off. This is wonderful. This flies in the face of logic to be brilliant. I'm going to finish my review of this with a passage from the novel. There are many truths, but power decides which truths are told as fact. Australia likes to narrate her story from the present, looking back. She pretends that she has grown up in a cohesive linear form, like the protagonist from a Victorian realist novel. She pretends that she's a credibly omnipotent narrator, worst of all when her ugly reality is held up in front of her like a mirror. She goes all Mrs. Havisham on you, gaslighting you, until you go along with her particular version of the truth. The Door by Magda Sazbo, translated from Hungarian by Len Rix. This is the first of two back-to-back novels I read with my Patreon book club, the reading of which was improved by hearing the thoughts and experiences of other people. So this is a great point to thank my Patreons and invite anybody interested in supporting this channel to join us in 2025. The Door is a novel that really gets better the more you think about it, the more you discuss it. I'm not sure I initially even rated this book 5 stars, but the more I discussed it, the more I considered it, the more I understood what the author was doing, the more I became absolutely amazed by what she had written. This is literature that is like truly beautiful art or an ancient monument. It just leaves you in awe. I can't believe the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, and I can't believe that Magda Sazbo wrote this book. Essentially, this is just the story of a relationship between two women set over 20 years, a wealthy author and her eccentric housekeeper or friend. It's a real-life babushka doll of a friendship. It's got themes of communist ideas, the intelligentsia versus the pros, bodily autonomy, legacy, love, sacrifice, and it represents the Hungary of old versus the new emerging Hungary. Something that has an extra layer of interest for readers now when you consider that this book was originally written in 1987 and we have close to 40 years of hindsight which Sazbo didn't have to compare this book to. And to bring you back to those pyramids, it's worth remembering when it was created, because that adds just that little bit more awe. The title takes its name from Emerence, the housekeeper's front door, something she doesn't allow anybody to see past, even when she is ill and risks death. She resorts to violence in her weakened state to keep people out. We all have our secrets. One of the things I'm so amazed that Sazbo does is to create two so thoroughly unlikable and uncharismatic characters and make me want to keep reading about them, make me care about them. There normally needs to be something to cheer for when I'm reading a book, but Sazbo just keeps you at a very basic level intrigued. Little events like Magna not displaying the gift Emerence got her has you holding your breath. Of course, these little events all carry greater meaning. Emerence is a representation of Hungarian communism and what happens when you are gifted with something and don't appreciate it. Sasbo isn't just critical of communism as well. I said both characters are unlikable, but it is how they are unlikable that represents the political systems Sasbo is critical of: communism and capitalism, the past and the present. Even things like Emerence's age being disputed, with some very unrealistic numbers floating about having her at well over 100, represent truth or fact under a communist government. While Magna's inability to accept Emerence as a true friend and to look at their relationship as that of employer and employee represents the cold indifference of capitalism and the stratification it creates. Sasbo even questions the idea of the collective versus the individual, and one would think that a communist government would grant the individual much less freedom. But what about the right to die? The attitudes both women have towards suicide and euthanasia run counter to the underlying ideas of the systems that they represent. But yet, don't they just feel a little bit correct? Sasbo is arguing that communism isn't actually communism, that freedom is only freedom if you fit in or are well off. And again, I think you have to remember when this book was written, there is so much to dissect. This book is doing so much. Read it slowly, read it with somebody, take notes and then reread it. Anybody discussing this book could say completely different things to me and be 100% correct, because there are so many themes in this. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, translated from French by Ros Swartz. This has to be the ultimate book club book. So many conversations come out of this one, beginning with, what genre is it anyway? As somebody who doesn't read a lot of sci-fi, I was really surprised when a member of my book club said that this was sci-fi. And then, as if to back it up, they asked the question, well, are we still even on Earth? This novel could also be a dystopian novel. It could be literary fiction, coming of age, feminist, LGBT, religious, or at least spiritual, and so much more. 39 women and one girl are locked in a bunker underground. They don't know why. They don't know what their crime is, or when or even if they'll be released. Underground, they have electric light stimulating day and night, but is it even on a 24-hour cycle? The men who guard them are not permitted inside the cage that they live in or to speak to them. Their only form of communication from the outside comes in the forms of whips. Don't try to hurt yourself, you'll be whipped. Don't try to hurt somebody else, you'll be whipped. Don't break the rules, you'll be whipped. What I think makes this book so amazing is that Hartman has considered exactly what you will learn and what you will remain ignorant of. Our natural drive for answers compels us to keep reading this and to consume it quickly. But some of the questions we have will never be answered, and questions that we don't even think about will be answered as this novel progresses. Everything in this novel can mean so many things. The title of this book is one such example. Sure, our protagonist has only known women and not men, but the word men could mean humans, couldn't it? She has never known human society, and actually, if you think about it, she has met men. They guard her. Their interactions are somewhat limited, but she's met them. It would have been more accurate to call this book I Who Have Never Known Children, and one could argue that Hartman is trying to argue that it is children or the next generation that make us human, that she has deconstructed society rather than gender here. And this is the analysis that comes out of the title of this book. What about the rest of it? What about the novel itself? This is a book about humanity. It is ultimately an exploration of nature versus nurture and what makes us human. And what meaning does our life have if we know we're going to be the last of our kind? I don't think I have ever read a book like this before, and I don't think I will read another book like this ever. Truly unique. And so I roar. by Abi Dare. The sequel to Dare's debut novel, The Girl with the Louding Voice, it continues on with Adane's quest to receive an education as members of her tribe turn up and insist on taking her back to the bush to face trial for murder. Adane faces a second fight if she is to receive the education that she wants, and potentially just to continue being alive. Miss Tia, who has already helped Adane so much, now has a terrible choice to make: protect Adane or learn the truth of a family secret. In this book, Tia takes a far more central role than in the first novel. It is really a dual protagonist novel. Abi Dare is the perfect story reader. This book just does everything so well. Dare's ability to tell a story is second to none. Adane is the perfect blend of intelligent and stupid, precocious and naive. She's driven, resourceful and intelligent, but also she's a 14-year-old girl who is from a tribe, not the city, and has had to work a lot for everything she gets in her life. She is so disadvantaged. She is a character that is so easy to support and cheer for. And writing teenagers, I think, is really hard. Not a lot of authors do it well. They miss something really simple. A teenager is not the logical linear point on a path between child and adult. Parts of them are fully formed adults and parts are still children, and they grow and change rapidly. And we see all of this in Adane. Next to Tia, a woman in her 30s who is completely stable in comparison. These characters are so expertly crafted, and it really makes the plot sing. A good plot is not really about events, it's about getting the reader to invest. The stakes on offer almost don't matter, and as if to demonstrate that, Adane is facing a situation where she could lose her life, but you can feel how important it is to her to be believed, to clear her name, and that is what you're supporting more than her staying alive. That's how much you're investing in her as a character. The plot is brilliant on its own. So much happens, and while it's clear Dare has an endpoint, she's not getting there in a linear fashion. Instead, there's going to be twists and turns. Each one of those twists and turns highlights her underlying theme, the value of women, particularly young women, in Nigerian society. There are other themes here. Female genital mutilation is part of this novel, as too is childbirth, but these things link back to our major theme. Adane finds several other girls, all with their own dreams, and as if to demonstrate that they're neither children or adults, they play of being on the Oprah show. One girl hosts as the others share their dreams and their fears. While Adane wants to be educated, another girl wants to be an actress. And they're not big dreams. Dare placed these dreams obtainably close to these girls and then drives a canyon between them. It's here, but yet it's also impossible. I just don't see how anybody could not like this book. It's literary, it's commercial, it's devastating, it's hilarious, it's frightening, it's thought-provoking, and it has atmospheric prose, making a point that is so hard to ignore and disagree with. And with Adane and Tia, you have two very different but equally easy to love characters. This is very close to the perfect book. The Lost Love Songs of Boise Singh by Ingrid Persaud. Boise Singh was a famous Trinidadian pirate. He is rumoured to have killed hundreds of people, dumping their body at sea. Persaud is telling us his life through the 4 women that he loved. And while we'll learn a lot about Boise Singh's life, it is the lives of these women that dominate the novel. Manalala is the mother, a woman who loves Boise so much, who knew him when he was nothing. But as the novel progresses, their only connection is the son Chunksy they have together, and she will use that child as a way of staying close to Boise, as she feeds off scraps of attention, hoping one day to be the woman that Boise picks. Popo meets Boise while she is selling sex, and Boise moves from her client to her lover. Popo's business acumen is useful to Boise, helping him change both of their lives. Unlike the first two women, Doris knows exactly who Boise is when she first meets him, but he offers her a chance to climb social ladders, and she believes she can be the woman to get him to shape up. As Boise woos her relentlessly, she holds out for what she knows she wants. Rosie wants nothing to do with Boise. She has a simple life and wants to run her store, but Boise forces her to pay rent, and she gets inexplicably caught up in his life. Not one of these women will leave the book unharmed, but which one or ones of them will survive? The plot is amazing. You always want to keep reading. There's about 5 things you want resolved at any one point. The dialect that this book is written in is wonderful. Not only does it build a sense of place, it gives the prose such wonderful rhythm. It is really a delight to read. The island setting really builds your fear for everybody in this novel. There is nowhere to run if things go wrong. And you know with Boise around that it's not an if, but a when. But it is these 4 women that elevate this book. It adds such a feminist theme to this novel. We see the various options available to women at the time. We see how their lives are trapped by the men they know, and how one horrible man leaves them all a shell of themselves. But it is in the depth of these characters, and Boise for that matter, that makes this book. How does Persaud make Boise such a despicable character who you find yourself slowly forgiving and rooting for, only for him to do something else terrible to remind you that he's a mass killer, he's a pirate, he's a gangster. But for all of that, you find yourself slipping back in like with Boise. You never like him more than any of the 4 women, but you do kind of want him to win, and that isn't right. Another aspect that Persaud includes that was really interesting was the Indian Trinidadian perspective. We think of the Caribbean as a culture with African roots, but almost any culture is more complex than that. You know, I really enjoy learning about other cultures through literature, and this is a culture that is hardly ever explored in literature, a minority of a minority. Chunksy is another interesting aspect of this book. Growing up the son of a gangster who is constantly being pulled between his mother and his father, we see his loyalties change. We see his ideals grow and shrink. We see his desires. It is such a magnificent coming of age side plot for this novel. There is a commonality with some other Caribbean novels, and I think if you'd like books such as How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, then this is a book you should be adding to your TBR ASAP. Antibot by Sierra Grier. I wouldn't have guessed that I'd have 2 science fiction novels in my top 10 at the start of the year, but this is what good science fiction does. It starts with an idea and then it explores humanity. Doug has recently broken up with his long-term girlfriend. As a rich businessman, he decides to purchase a robot girlfriend, Antibot. He can adjust her libido. It's higher on the weekend. And Annie is learning to adjust her libido on her own, based on Doug's mood. Annie is very intelligent, but she's clearly not human. She doesn't understand social etiquette, and this infuriates Doug. Doug has bought a sex robot, but he expects Annie to cook and clean, and neat freak Doug doesn't like that Annie isn't the perfect cleaner. I mean, he could have bought a cleaning robot, but he did buy the sex model. Annie observes that she has left 5 grams of salt on the bench counter one day. The layers in this novel are wonderful. This is such a feminist novel, and you cannot help but to consider Annie as a human. And you can see so many issues of an abusive relationship being represented. But it also asks questions about AI. How many of us have been frustrated by Siri or ChatGPT? I hope that nobody watching would call their partner stupid if they didn't understand something they said. But Siri or ChatGPT, I have to confess, I have abused AI in my time as a way of venting my frustration at not being understood. And I would never do that to a human. You know, I only ever do that to my dog in a light-hearted, joking tone. It's so interesting how we respect or don't respect different people, objects, things, animals. And in Doug's mind, Annie is a purchase, she's an object, but to us, the reader, who is reading Annie's narration of the events, she meets our requirement as a human. You do understand Doug's frustration, but you can't help but to think that he is a pathetic, toxic pig who is just abusing his girlfriend. All of this is great, but Gruyere includes so many little details that spark your brain in different directions. Annie looks like Doug's ex, but Doug's ex was black and Annie isn't. Obviously, this feels really wrong, but why? That's a conversation starter right there. That's a topic to digest, and that can go in many different directions. When Doug first gets Annie, she's very naive. She comes across as a child in an adult's body, yet Doug has sex with her. We all know it's wrong for a 40-something-year-old man to have sex with a teenager, but you're forced to consider why that is. It's not just a rule. There's a reason for it. And Gruyere is so good at forcing you to focus in on the micro issues to show you the macro impacts, to show you what it's actually about. There are so many different topics this book brings up. It is a conversation starter. It's a brilliant book club pick. And I'm really shocked that this book hasn't gained more attention. This is the sort of book that once you finish reading it, you want to force it into somebody else's hands. Make them read it Clockwork Orange style so that you can chat about it, which I think might actually be counter to what this book is saying about bodily autonomy, but anyway. And I feel like I've been saying this a lot about the books today and about books that I really love in general, but this is a great literary fiction book that is also a great commercial fiction book. It starts conversation, but it also respects the fact that novels are there to entertain us, make me think, show me art, but also let me have fun. Let me enjoy myself. Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. I finished this book in February, and I knew then that this would be the best book I read all year. I hoped I would read a better book, but really, I knew the odds were staggeringly low. Now, big caveat, most of the books on this list are novels that are going to work for most people, but Boy Parts is a real love it or hate it novel, and it is unapologetically so. It takes some big risks. This book is dark and it crosses the line intentionally so many times. I explained to him that nothing matters and nothing lasts. Everyone forgets and everyone disappears. That the things you do, the things you are, it's all nothing. Would anybody miss you if you went away? Would anybody look for you? Would anybody listen or even care if I hurt you? If I put my hands around your neck and crushed your windpipe and chopped you up? Would anybody find you? And if it's a no to any of these, did you even exist in the first place? Our narrator, Irina, is an artist from Newcastle, England, and her anger comes through in every sentence of this novel. At over 6 foot tall, Irina is hot, and she makes transgressive arts that look at sex, violent consent, and taboo sexuality. She becomes obsessed with a young man who works at a local supermarket, a man who is 5'2". The power dynamic of their relationship is the opposite of everything you expect in a feminist exploration of toxic relationships. Irina is the abusive one. She convinces him to model for one of her photo shoots, making him wear a mask so that she can't see his face. And then she does something with a glass bottle that really you ought to ask for consent before doing, or at least Vaseline. Once the shoot is over, she is shocked to see him crying and spits out, "If you weren't into it, you should have just said something." It's such a powerful scene, and it says so much about toxic relationship. While this relationship is flipped and challenges gender roles, it is not a completely different world. Irina is still living in a world where she needs to keep an eye on her drink when she goes out. It's just that instead of being a victim of all the horrible stuff, she is fighting back, maybe not in an appropriate way, but the origins of and the outlets for her rage is so clear. Add into this a clear eating disorder, a complicated relationship with her own body, and relationships with her friend and mother that border on hateful. You have such an interesting protagonist, the kind of person who you don't want to be friends with, but yet you can't take your eyes off. This is not just a feminist novel. Irina's art is really important to the novel too. A struggling artist from a poor background, she's invited to display her work at a prestigious London gallery. One thing that you never doubt in this novel is Irina's artistic talent, even if her processes are not entirely ethical. Yet Irina's thoughts on some of her fellow artists who are being displayed are not exactly complimentary. Irina is our narrator and she's certainly not reliable, so it is kind of magical the way Clarke makes you trust her artistic opinion even if you trust nothing else that she says. Seeing who is deserving of the chances they get and who isn't is a great way of illustrating that it is easier to succeed if you are rich, a man, and if you're in the UK, live in the South. If you're not familiar with the North-South divide in the UK, maybe think of it as the city-country divide that exists in a lot of other countries, but make the employment a lot more industrial. This is a feminist novel, but Irina is not a feminist character. She is selfish and all sorts of problematic. She is the manifested rage of a society that chews up women and treats them as objects without opinion, but most of all, ignores them. At some point, Irina screams, "What will it take for somebody to see me as a threat?" And you're left wondering, is this Irina thinking about her career, her place in the world, her role as a woman, or the growing hints Clarke has placed that she may have killed? Imagine Sally Rooney wrote a horror movie, or the much more talented child of My Year of Rest and Relaxation, a book I loved, with American Psycho, a book that I did not. Irina Sturgis is the ultimate unlikable protagonist, the ultimate unreliable rater. You shouldn't relate to her as a character, but her anger, that is very relatable. And I can't tell if Eliza Clarke found this book cathartic to write, or if I should be scared to be in the same room as her. And I have not yet mentioned that this book is incredibly funny. A strong flavour, and if you need to check trigger warnings, don't even pick this one up. Let me know your favourite book of 2024 in the comments section. Like this video and subscribe to this channel for more bookish videos in 2025. Bye bye.